Hi everyone, my name is Laura Martin and I want to welcome you to my talk today, which is going to be on the concept of oppressive social practices. So, to get started with the general problem, the concept of systemic oppression raises a puzzle for social ontology. While a dominant assumption is that social phenomena must be understood ultimately in terms of the psychological states and actions of individuals, systemic oppression arises from social structures, such that an individualistic ontology will threaten to obscure how systemic oppression persists and changes. One recently emerging consensus is that conceptualizing oppression in terms of practices provides a promising alternative to an individualistic approach. But what does it mean to understand oppression as a practice? And how does this framework contribute to our understanding of oppression? I want to propose that an account of oppressive practices must render intelligible two features of systemic oppression that seem to stand in tension. On the one hand, such an account must capture the fact that it is agents who uphold oppression. On the other hand, agents often experience systemic forms of oppression as if they do not flow from their own agency, but are already out there in the world. So, in other words, not only do we not get to choose oppressive meanings and norms, but these also come to constrain what we can do. A central challenge for any account of oppressive social practices must therefore be in a position to explain how it is that practices can come to constrain the very agents who bring them into being. In this paper and presentation today, I want to propose that if this challenge is to be met, we're going to need the right conception of an important component of practices, which I will refer to as intersubjective meanings. This refers to the tacit meanings, norms, and assumptions embedded in oppressive practices, and these are thought widely to play a critical role in the perpetuation of oppression. The thought is that if the tacit meanings that underpin a practice entail oppressive stereotypes, then agents may well enact oppression unwittingly, simply by carrying out the practice. What I will argue and try to show in this presentation is that if an account of practice is to meet the challenge that I laid out initially, we need to distinguish between two ways of conceptualizing intersubjective meanings. The central difference being that one conception is robustly intersubjective, while the other is not. The main task that I will take up today is to spell out what exactly this conception consists in, and, positively, how it helps us to make sense of the peculiar feature of oppressive practices in which I am interested. Namely, the sense in which even though oppressive practices are upheld by agents, they can nevertheless come to constrain and appear to be external to those very agents. The general structure of my talk today will be as follows. I'm going to begin in the next slide by describing what I'm going to take in this talk to be a paradigmatic example of an oppressive social practice, which is drawn from C.J. Pascal's ethnography about how high school boys navigate gender and sexuality. In the second part of the talk, I'm going to lay out the more general theoretical way that I understand the concept of a practice, including these two ways in which one might understand what I think is a sort of central concept of intersubjective meanings. And then finally, I'm going to take the theoretical framework developed in the second part of the talk and show how it helps us to understand the example described in the first part. So, the example that I want to focus on comes from an ethnography by C.J. Pascal in which she observes the behavior of high school students. One of her central concepts that she develops in the book is what she calls the fag discourse, and this refers to the many games, jokes, and interactions among male students at the school which revolved around this slur. Pascal's central argument is that though it is tempting to interpret the pervasiveness of this term solely as an expression of homophobia, in fact, it ought to be interpreted more broadly as, quote, a symbol around which contests for masculinity took place. Pascal bases this argument on her observations of how this slur was used in practice, noting, for instance, the act of calling another boy by this slur was a way to stigmatize behavior that was perceived to fall short of a masculine ideal. A boy might be called by this name, for instance, for showing weakness, any kind of incompetence, or affection towards a student of the same sex. Although the pervasiveness of this slur among the boys was tightly connected to homophobia, Pascal sees it more centrally as a way in which masculinity was enforced and regulated by the boys themselves, a claim she supports by noting that no similar behavior occurred among female students, and that the slur was used in all kinds of contexts to stigmatize behavior not directly related to sexuality, but more broadly to what she describes as failures of masculinity. One general consequence of the prevalence of this practice at the school was that the boys came to closely monitor their own behavior to ensure they did not fall afoul of an array of unspoken rules about how to walk, talk, treat other people, and even what it was appropriate for them to care about. And I will return to this example in the final part of this talk. In what sense, then, should we understand this activity as a social practice? To answer this question, of course, we have to know what a social practice is. And I'm going to propose that social practices are composed of the four components of constitutive rules, constitutive distinctions, intersubjective meanings, and social roles. For the purpose of this presentation, I want to sort of focus more of my attention on this concept of intersubjective meanings, and so I'm only going to briefly discuss these other elements, but of course in the Q&A you can feel free to ask me more about this broader theoretical picture. A social practice, broadly, is a structured human activity that transforms brute facts, or the bare existence that physical entities, behaviors, and bodies possess, into social facts. The concept of practice explains how this transformation is accomplished. A key feature of practices are constitutive rules, or rules that establish the conditions under which a brute fact counts as a social fact, and which thereby enable practices to be carried out in the first place. This is perhaps best illustrated with the example of the rules of voting. These are rules that establish the conditions under which a marked piece of paper counts as a valid vote, and they are constitutive rules in the sense that if one fails to follow them, one is simply failing to vote. Practices, however, are not just arbitrary collections of rules, but rather are rules that are unified in such a way that justifies their classification as a practice, as opposed, for instance, to several distinct practices or not a practice at all. We can understand this idea in terms of what Charles Taylor calls a constitutive distinction. This is a significant contrast a practice draws that signals its broader purpose or significance. A practice's constitutive distinction and its rules have a mutually constitutive relationship. It is through a practice's rules that its constitutive distinction is expressed, but it is the distinction itself that explains why particular rules are part of the practice. Again, to refer back to the example, the distinction between a valid and invalid vote is central to the practice of voting. Yet this distinction has to be expressed through the specific rules of the practice. For instance, the mandate that ballots be marked in private booths. At the same time, the overall coherence of the rules of voting is rooted in this distinction, and in particular, the specific understanding it expresses of what it means to cast a valid vote, one that prioritizes the minimization of coercion on individual voters, for example. A propose that we can understand this third and fourth components of practices, social roles and intersubjective meanings, as standing in a similar kind of relation as do rules and the distinctions they express. Social roles, which I am going to understand in a fairly intuitive sense as a position an agent occupies, such as being a father or being a student, presuppose implicit intersubjective meanings, which Charles Taylor defines as the vision of the agent and his relation to others and to society that is implicit in practices. While agents are, for the most part, aware that they occupy a social role, because intersubjective meanings are implicit, agents are rarely aware of the meanings that give rise to the roles or statuses they inhabit. And more generally, intersubjective meanings are broader in scope than social roles. They entail very general conceptions of the self and ways of understanding the world and one's place in it. What I want to suggest is that we can think about intersubjective meanings in two senses, and the distinction in which I'm interested is well articulated by Vincent Descombe. On the first conception, Descombe writes, intersubjective meanings do not bring together two free subjectivities, but two partners who must do different things and whose roles or statuses are determined by an established rule. This he contrasts to a second conception, in which what agents have in common can be traced to the influence of their respectively similar milieu. I take the contrast Descombe is drawing here to turn on what exactly it means for a practice to be social in nature, or to put it slightly differently, on how practices relate agents to one another. The relevant difference, as I see it, is as follows. The first conception sees the practice, or in Descombe's words, the established rule, as providing agents with roles or statuses. An agent's participation in the practice is mediated through the role or status they occupy. The practices, moreover, involve two partners who must do different things, which means that to properly inhabit one's status or role, and to properly carry out the practice more broadly, another agent has to occupy a complementary status. So we might think, for example, of trying to occupy the role of teacher if there are no students, or if students are behaving in a highly disruptive way. You might say, you know, I just can't do my job, or like, I can't teach. So in that sense, the practice as a whole and to properly occupy your role requires someone else to play their complementary part. The second conception, meanwhile, sees agents as related to one another, not through complementary roles or statuses allotted by a practice, in the way alluded to by the first conception, but simply by virtue of a shared social background, or what Descombe calls a similar milieu, and the similar ideas these agents develop as a result. Although I do not see these conceptions as necessarily mutually exclusive, I want to suggest that it is the first conception we need if we are to genuinely understand the nature of oppressive social practices. So my focus is going to be on the positive argument that I want to make for the first conception, as opposed to making a negative argument about the second conception, although I'm also happy to talk about that in the Q&A. To show why this is the case, consider how the theoretical picture I have sketched in part 2 of this talk illuminates the example described initially. We can well see the practice Pascal describes as constructed around a particular vision of the agent, one who is esteemed and valued for traits such as strength, competence, a capacity for sexualized forms of dominance, heterosexuality, and a preference for masculine-coded activities, clothing, etc. At the same time, the practice also entails a contrasting vision of the agent as shameful, weak, incompetent, and interested in activities and modes of self-presentation deemed inappropriately feminine. These intersubjective meanings, which we might refer to as masculinity and failed masculinity, give a coherence to the practice as a whole, as the students strive to live up to the ideal of masculinity it entails, while striving at the same time to avoid falling into the second shameful category. I want to suggest that there are three features of this practice that come into view once we see it through the lens of Descombe's first conception of intersubjective meanings. And so in the rest of the talk, I'm going to try to spell out these features that I think are really made vivid once we see the practice in terms of this first conception. The first feature of this practice, and of oppressive practices more broadly, that this conception highlights, is both its intersubjective character and the sense in which it is somehow self-perpetuating. The idea that agents, quote, must do different things in a practice, as I have said, highlights the mutually constitutive character of the statuses or roles in practices. In the fag discourse, we see this complementary nature of the statuses involved. The traits that are stigmatized, such as passivity and weakness, are the very converse of those that are esteemed, such as assertiveness and strength. In addition, as I have said, this idea points to the fact that both statuses must be occupied if the practice as a whole is to be coherent. So, in the context of the example, in order to live up to the ideal of masculinity, in order to express this sort of esteemed and valued position, someone else has to occupy the shameful position. As Pascal writes, quote, "The fag identity was fluid, an identity that no boy wanted, but that most boys could escape, usually by engaging in some sort of discursive contest to turn another boy into a fag. One of the best ways to move out of this position was to thrust another boy into it." In other words, in order to embody and express the esteemed status of being manly or masculine, required another boy to occupy the devalued status, such that the act of calling another boy by this slur, while seeking to avoid the label oneself, was bound up with an attempt to embody this valued and esteemed status. And so I think we can see, too, the way in which this practice had a kind of self-perpetuating character. If you were stigmatized by this slur, the only way that you had to escape that stigma was to perpetuate the practice by pinning this label on another boy at the school. The second feature that I think understanding the practice in this way brings out is this idea that the practice as a whole transcended the individual agency of those who upheld the practice. So one of the key elements in the conception that Descombe describes is the claim that it is the practice or the established rule that allots complementary statuses, and not the individual qua individual. This is why, as Descombe puts it, practices do not bring together two free subjectivities, but rather agents who must do different things. But how can a practice allot statuses to agents? Recall from the second part of the talk that the rules of practices are constitutive. They determine the conditions under which a brute fact is a social fact, and they enable practices to be carried out in the first place. In the case of the fag discourse, the rules determine which behaviors count as the stigmatized kind of act that Pascal terms fag behavior, and which we can understand as the social fact in question. These rules make it possible to perform this practice in the first place. If the practice did not, for instance, dictate that the act of holding hands with someone of the same sex, or showing care or concern about one's clothing, was shameful, the practice itself would lose its point. Not only would there be no incentive to call another boy this slur, but even if one did, it would not have the effect that it does when it is entrenched in a practice. In short, while the practice condemns, quote, fag behavior as shameful, it is the practice itself that simultaneously creates this very category. This provides one way to understand the claim that it is the practice that sets up and allots statuses to agents. Although a common assumption is that roles or statuses are logically prior to the actions they entail, the fag discourse partially reverses this order. Instead of occupying a status that then guides one's actions, it is how one acts with respect to the practice's rules that determines the status one occupies. By violating a rule of this practice, for example, showing some kind of concern over the stylishness or the cleanliness of one's clothes, one does not just engage in stigmatized behavior, but one is condemned rather to the shameful status of being the fag. This means that the status one occupies is partially determined by rules that one doesn't choose. Moreover, one is placed in this status only through the judgment of others who are also operating on the basis of these rules, which again, they do not choose. Though one can modify one's outward behavior in order to be perceived in a certain way by others, one cannot fully adopt nor cast off this status at will. And so I think in this sense we can understand the way in which, even though the boys are upholding this practice, there's a very real sense in which the practice as a whole transcends the agency of any one individual involved in it. Finally, I think that we can also see the sense in which this practice has a kind of external character to those who uphold it. Often it is said that people internalize certain ideas and that this is the way in which oppression is perpetuated. So in this example, one might think that the boys have internalized ideas about masculinity, which lead them to act as they do. Yet I think that this obscures crucial features of the example. One implication of this is that the boys act on the basis of deeply held ideas. And yet I think that the boys' adherence to the rules of this practice is much more other-directed than this acknowledges. What they do is constrained primarily by an awareness that certain behaviors are going to be perceived as shameful, and a desire to be seen or not seen in a certain light by others. Although this may be consistent with the boys having internalized ideas about masculinity, I think it is equally consistent with the boys holding no deep ideas about masculinity, or at least no ideas that are so internalized that they would continue to change their activity if the practice itself changed. If, for instance, caring about the style and cleanliness of one's clothes suddenly became cool or macho. Indeed, the language of internalization gives the impression that because the boys act on the basis of ideas to which they personally subscribe, they then follow the rules automatically. Yet this was not the case, and the rules of this practice had to instead be actively and often aggressively enforced, often through mockery. This need for constant active enforcement of the rules lends credence to the idea that, in inquiring into why the boys participate in this practice, we ought to look not at internalized ideas, but at the fabric of status, judgment, and intersubjective relations that the boys both create and in which they find themselves. So, to conclude, I have argued for one way in which we should understand this concept of an oppressive social practice, and I hope to have shown through this example the kinds of features that are brought into view once we look at social phenomena through this theoretical lens. Thank you very much, and I look forward to hopefully being able to interact with some of you in the virtual Q&A.